Welcome to the Inquisitive Minds podcast. This podcast is all about searching for answers to questions oftentimes unexplained or unexplored. We want to engage with new and sometimes old theories, psychology, or philosophy from a research based perspective. Today, it's critical thinking. So, John, how are you doing today, and how are you feeling about this topic?
I'm doing pretty good today. And I think this topic is a great first topic to sort of build on because going forward with all this sort of research we will be doing, critical thinking plays an incredibly vast role because we will have to sift through so much information and not just take it
hmm
for granted, see what's
Yeah,
true or not.
yeah, definitely. I think critical thinking is going to be a perfect first episode, a great building block for us moving forward. And with that being said, I want to try to start this episode with an analogy. So, a good way of looking at critical thinking is if let's say you're posed with this scenario. You're in a different country than your original country. Let's say you're in like New Zealand or something. It's also English speaking. And you're watching a newscast, and you see in the newscast there's a journalist questioning the leader of New Zealand. And the journalist asks the leader of New Zealand, they say, "Why is it that you spent all that money on your friends and not on something else that was to do with politics? Why did you spend this was a huge scandal in our country. Why did you spend all this money on your friends and you did it behind our backs and the taxpayers didn't know and all this stuff?" And then the president or the leader steps back and says, "Whoa, I'm sorry, but that's just not true. I did spend that money, but it went to a good cause and it was all recorded in our books and it was signed off by our parliament and everything was done according to order. So I'm unsure of where you're coming from with this." So now you're given two explanations or two kind of questions. Who's correct? Is it the journalist who's correct in saying it was a scandal, or is the president correct in saying that there was no scandal? So this is where critical thinking comes in. You have in this situation you have no biases. But this is also a very similar situation to if you were watching Donald Trump in the United States take a question and the person says, "How could you do such a thing?" And Donald Trump says, "Fake news." It's almost the same thing, right? So in the second situation with Donald Trump, you're more likely to have an opinion one way or the other. I'm personally going to stay out of it, but if you're already going to have a decision in your mind, I like him, I don't like him, and therefore you're going to have an opinion. But in the first case, you're less biased, and that's how you should be coming into almost all critical thinking, I think.
Yeah, totally. Not jumping in immediately and formulating like an opinion off your emotions,
Mhm.
but rather like thinking clearly and rationally about what to do and like what to believe by actually using like skills of analysis and evaluation.
Right, definitely. So with that being said, I think this is where our research kind of kicks off here. And John, I wanted to get your definition. We both kind of the first thing we did was try to find a good definition for critical thinking. So what did you have there?
Well, sort of what I kind of just said. Like, it's the ability to think clearly and rationally about what to do and what to believe.
hmm
So it's like developing that ability, right?
hmm
And so like you can kind of break it down into even smaller kind of skills to work on, like observation. That's sort of the first thing you do,
hmm
and then you analyze it, you make some inferences, you communicate, and then you use that and problem solve. So if you kind of work on these smaller skills, I think it eventually kind of builds into the whole of critical thinking.
Yeah, totally. I had pretty much a similar definition, but mine was a way of using objective analysis to assess the validity of a claim, form reasonable arguments, and formulate a sound set of beliefs. So kind of overarching what you just said,
Hmm.
to going into more of a background and looking at philosophers. So did you want to start with? I think
Yeah.
we both did a bit of a historical deep dive here and tried to look at who were the founding fathers of this kind of critical thinking philosophy and how they were influenced and how they influenced us nowadays. So, what did you have
Yeah,
for that, John?
I'll start with Plato. He was like one of the OGs, right?
Hmm.
And he kind of had this theory where he broke the soul into like three aspects. It was the rational, the emotional, and the physical desires.
Okay.
And he says that the rational should be in the forefront. That should kind of be the decision maker for all the others. Whereas like some people like to think emotionally, right?
Hmm.
But he
Hmm.
he he thinks that the rational should be the forefront, the one that drives all the others down the line.
Right.
So like him saying that way back whenever is kind of, I think, the first time I kind of ran into the history of kind of thinking rationally, kind of
Hmm.
more critically.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like so many years ago, he was kind of the first one to put this idea forward, I think.
Yeah, like to seek truth from facts and argument, right? I
Hmm.
think that's the big component to it.
Definitely. Well, the next person that I found was a philosopher named Stephen Tolman. And what he did was he wrote a book called The Model of an Argument. An argument in this case, of course, meaning not some sort of verbal threatening back and forth or some sort of
Fisticuffs.
fight. Yeah, fisticuffs. Nothing like that, but more of here's my set of claims and they together meet this end conclusion. So he kind of wrote a book about how to formulate an argument and what a model of an argument looked like. So what he did was he broke it into six parts. The first three were mandatory. You had to have these in an argument. And then the last three were kind of as additional measures, not always necessary, but sometimes necessary in an argument. So the first thing in an argument was a claim or conclusion. So a conclusion whose merits must be established. So for example, I would say the grass is green. That's like a conclusion. Then there's the grounds, the facts, the evidence, the data that supports this. So I would say I can look at the grass. It is green. That is my ground. And then there's a warrant, so a statement authorizing movement from the ground to the claim. So for example, I can say, we all look and witness that the grass is green. Like it's not just me, it's all of us seeing that the grass is green, therefore the grass is green.
Is there a specific or any specific order to these three main ones, or they can sort of be in any order?
Yeah, definitely. The order can definitely change. So for example, I can say, guys, look, everybody look. The grass, what color is it? It's green. And then I can say the grass is green, and that's my
Yeah, you
ending.
present your evidence and then make the conclusion.
Hmm. There's the three other ones that he puts in are called the backing. So let's say you want more credentials to clarify the statement in the warrant. So for in this example, I could say, well, the grass, what's making the grass green? I could say the grass is comprised of chlorophyll and it gives it its green pigment, and that's what we're perceiving with our eyes, and so on and so forth. So that's called the backing. And then there's the rebuttal. So it's like statements that recognize the restrictions of the conclusion. So for example, I can say the grass is green unless it has wilted and died, in which case it becomes brown. And then the last thing is the qualifier. So this is when you use words such as probably or possibly. So for in this example, I could say the grass is green unless somebody spray painted it orange or something, right?
Hmm.
So presumably the grass is green unless somebody painted orange. These are so this is why these three are kind of the additional ones. It kind of helps you make the argument a lot clearer and set boundaries for the argument.
Yeah, add some like beef to it, right? Especially the
Hmm.
rebuttal. Oh, I mean
Yeah,
and the
definitely.
backing, I should say.
Hmm. So that was my philosopher, Stephen Tolman. Did you have any other philosophers?
Uh, I found out Bertrand Russell had ended up having a 10 commandments of critical thinking, which
Mm.
was very convenient for sure. So I'm not gonna just rifle off all 10, but I will mention the few that stuck out for me that I
Hmm.
enjoyed. So the first one, do not feel absolutely certain of anything.
Okay, yeah. That's the bread and butter right there, I guess, eh?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Another one. Do not think of it worthwhile to proceed by concealing evidence, for the evidence is sure to come to light.
Okay, interesting. So that one's kind of saying like speak truthfully about most things you're trying to evaluate, I guess.
Hmm.
Okay.
When you meet with opposition, even if it should be from your husband or your child, endeavor to overcome it by argument and not by authority.
Oh, I see. So this is, I think we'll talk about this a bit later, but this is kind of like an appeal to authority. Don't people use it the other way where it's like this authority figure is saying that I should do this thing, therefore I must do this thing. But this one of the commandments is saying don't use your authority to win arguments, essentially.
Yeah, so like you always see parents talking to their children like it's because I said so.
Yeah, yeah. Ugh.
That's it's like not actually telling them why. It's like you're just using your authority and not actually overcoming it by argument.
Yeah, that would
It's
we've
like
all had that interaction.
no, it's just
uh,
like don't explain it to them. Let me just say why. Like
right.
another one, do not fear to be eccentric in opinion, for every opinion now accepted was once eccentric.
Oh, I like that one. That one's interesting. I guess that's kind of saying like just because you're having that thought and that opinion doesn't mean that it eventually will become mainstream.
It
Eh,
it it reminds me like my first thought now. It just reminds me of like Galileo, right? When
mm-hmm.
he's like, oh, I think we all revolve around the sun or whatever, but the prevailing theory at the time was the Earth was at the center.
Yeah, and that was heavily ingrained from an authority, which was the Catholic Church.
Yeah, so like he had an eccentric opinion there,
Hmm.
but now it's for now every opinion now accepted was once eccentric. So now it's an accepted opinion, but it once was eccentric.
Yeah, highly eccentric.
Find more pleasure in intelligent dissent than in passive agreement. For if you value intelligence as you should, the former implies a deeper argument than the latter, or
Oh,
deeper
okay.
agreement.
Yeah, yeah, I understand this one. So this is this is what I kind of get in trouble for with a lot of people, where I'm like trying to have an argument and maybe stirring the pot and trying to question somebody's beliefs on things, and then they get annoyed and they say, "Well, why do you always argue so much?" And it's like, well, I'd rather not passively agree with you and just kind of roll over this topic. I want to actually understand where you're coming from. I want to actually understand your arguments and why you believe a certain thing. And if I think you're wrong in your opinion, I'll push to try to change your mind. And people find this kind of an annoying personal trait, you know?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Argument for argument's sake. I find I kind of fall victim to this in terms of in not so much passive agreement, but I just won't agree out loud. I'm like, okay, you can have your opinion, and I just won't say anything and just move on.
Right, you kind of you don't even let them talk.
No,
You
like
just kind of like,
they'll just keep talking, and I'm like, okay, sure, yeah, right, like,
oh
but not
boy.
out loud.
Right, right.
Which,
Well,
as this says it, I
maybe you
should
shouldn't do.
probably argue them.
Yeah.
And then the last one I liked was, do not feel envious of the happiness of those who live in fool's paradise, for only a fool will think that is happiness.
Oh, ignorance is bliss, I see. But not according to Bertrand Russell.
You just live your own happiness.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good capper, I think, on those commandments. Did you have any? I was out of philosophers. Did you have any
Yeah,
other
I
ones?
had one more guy that was kind of the devil's advocate to critical thinking, which I found was fascinating
Oh, okay.
because it's just something odd thing to kind of disagree with. But
Yeah.
he his it's not so much that he like disagreed with it in the sense he was more like kind of picking out certain flaws of kind of
Okay.
how it was described, I suppose.
Right. Okay.
So he didn't really like kind of believe in causation, like the force that compels one event to follow another. He
Interesting.
he kind of explains it in the sense like so one event and then event two. So event two happens because of event one, so there's kind of like a causation there.
Hmm.
But he explains it in the sense they're completely individual. So event one happens and event two happens, and they're just totally separate, and they were going to happen regardless if there was some sort of event one causing event two. And he explains this cause and effect as like a merely human expectation projected into reality.
Okay. So
So like we think that event 2 happened because of event 1 because that's what we think, right? That's kind of like our expectation, kind of our experience like
in the
as
world, yeah.
in the world as humans, right? But he's
Yeah.
saying like that's just us saying that kind of in the same sort of thing as like we like have time and stuff, right? It's kind of like a human creation.
Okay.
So
That's
he's
interesting.
he's sort of comparing it like that. So it's kind of like hard to argue because like sure he's right in the terms of how do you argue that, but
Hmm.
yeah.
So I was I'm kind of a scientific kind of guy, and in science you learn that like if particle, one chemical and another chemical mix, and they're always at the same conditions when they mix, they'll always have the same reaction, and something will happen, and you'll have this after the reaction chemical, right? Maybe they combine, maybe something happens. So he's saying that if I have the same conditions and I apply the chemicals in the same way every time, there might be a different event than what is predicted. That like
Mm, not how I kind
that's
of
not how you're reading it.
one event followed by the other. So like say you bounce a ball and the
Hmm.
ball is goes back up in the air is like event two, whereas event one is you bouncing it. So kind
Hmm.
of it going up is kind of the cause of you bouncing it down.
Hmm. And if you bounce down with the same force every single time at the exact same with the same ball on the same surface, it'll bounce up the same height every time, right? That's what we would kind of collect. Like the cause of the bouncing causes the exact same height of the ball every time if it's in the exact same conditions. But he's saying something might change.
He,
He's saying you can't know for sure.
I think he's just saying like that the ball going up was not the cause of you bouncing it down. Like it was,
Oh, it was just its own thing.
yeah.
That's
It's the experience of succession of one kind of event followed by another, and that so-called cause and effect is merely human expectation.
interesting. I don't really understand where he's coming from with this
I think
because
I'm just explaining it poorly, but that's kind of the gist of how it was written in the book, and that's kind of how I interpreted it.
okay. And what was the philosopher's name again?
David Hume.
David Hume. Okay, that feels like something I'd have to really look into more on his work and try to understand fully what he's getting at
So,
because
and he also another thing was he was quite skeptic of inductive reasoning.
okay.
Inductive reasoning could not be so he thinks inductive reasoning could not be relied on to lead us to the truth.
Interesting.
So inductive reasoning being like the process that leads us to make generalizations from observing a number of similar cases is kind of the example. So having observed many white swans but no black swans, one might seemingly be justified in conclusion that all swans are white.
Right.
But such generalizations go beyond what is given in experience and are not logically justified. So in that specific area, right, you can inductively reason that all swans are white. We've never seen a black swan here ever.
Hmm.
And you were, oh yeah, that seems correct, right? However, there's black swans have been found in like Australia or something, right? So
Right.
regularity does not rule out the possibility the next time something different will occur. So kind of what you were saying before is what kind of applies here.
Oh, I see.
So
Okay.
if like them mixing happens to go like 99 times in a row, there's still that he's still like there's still that possibility that one time something might be different. You could just never know for sure, right? Uncertainty.
Okay. So that's what he's arguing.
Yeah.
I understand that portion of it a little bit better, I think. And honestly, I think it's hard for me to agree with that kind of perception of reality.
But
You know
that
what I
kind
mean?
of goes along with Russell's 10 commandments is don't feel absolutely certain of anything.
Yeah.
If you're mixing these two things or oh yeah, they should always be this, I'm certain, then you kind of right away that's it seems to be off the
Yeah.
commandment.
It's true, but it's hard
I mean, you can
to
have
put
like
yourself in that mindset, right, where you believe something to be true no matter what. Like you look up at the sun and the sun is going to be bright in your eyes, regardless. Maybe it's cloudy or whatever, but you look up and there's the sun. Like it's always going to be there.
yeah,
But I guess maybe over thousands of years it won't be there.
yeah,
And then he'll be right, but yeah.
I mean,
It's just
it's
when
go on.
I was going to say when we're doing arguments and we're trying to find evidence to back something up, we use inductive reasoning, which you said before is where you build a bunch of evidence and then you use that evidence to make a conclusion, and the conclusion is not always certain, but because you have all this evidence, you're fairly certain of it. But
Yeah, to like
in
a
this,
high probability,
hmm
I don't think you can just have full certainty, right?
hmm so yeah, okay, that's really interesting. Um, I think that's where I wanted to end with the philosophers and trying to get like a good historical background, because right now I think we should move into more of how people use fallacies when making arguments. So this is
Like
something that you might use in your real life, everyday
yeah, like
kind of conversation.
argument tactics and
Hmm.
kind of spotting when someone is using a fallacy or even noticing your own sort of biases too.
Definitely. And just to explain what a fallacy is something that people put forth that it isn't very true. It's mainly in this case it's a debate tactic. It's something they're using to trick you into having an opinion one way or another. So I think we both picked out a couple of our favorite fallacies, and
Yeah.
we're going to explain them. So did you want to start with one, John?
Yeah, I'll start with like breaking down an argument into like deductive and inductive.
Okay.
So deductive is when the truth of the premises guaranteed the truth of the conclusion. So you lay out your premises and then you follow with the conclusion, and
Right.
and that is when it's like it guarantees the truth. So example, all humans are mortal. Peter is a human, thus Peter is mortal.
Yeah.
So that
Okay.
each premises are all true and it leads to the conclusion to confirm it, right? Peter is mortal because he's human.
Yeah.
And then you can have and then the inductive is when the truth of the premises do not guarantee the truth of the conclusion.
Okay.
Not saying like it's going to be wrong. It's more like it's probable. It's a high percentage that it's going to be, but you can't just guarantee it. Sort of like the deductive can.
Okay.
So then I guess you can lead into a fallacy.
Sure. So I think the one of the first fallacies I wanted to talk about was the tu quoque fallacy, which means you too in Latin. So this is when, let's say you're having an argument with someone and they point out hypocrisy in the argument. So let's say I'm like talking to Johnny. I'm like, Johnny, you spent so much money on that car and it really wasn't worth it. You bought this super sports car and all you do is commute back and forth in traffic and work. Like you're never going to use that. Why did you spend all that money? And then he says to me, well, you spent all that money on your computer when you were souping it up. And all you do is play that one game and it doesn't even use high graphics. So what he did there was he used hypocrisy to make an argument. And this is actually a really good debate tactic in political debates, not informal debates. In political debates, it's a good tactic because it paints the opponent in a bad light, but it never actually discredits the original argument. So John says to me, I spent so much money on my computer, blah, blah, blah. But he's never addressing the fact that he spent so much money on the sports car. He's never discrediting it. So this argument tactic, you'll probably see it a lot, and you just understand that when somebody is using hypocrisy in this way, they're not discrediting the original argument, and they're mainly just trying to distract.
Yeah, that being a distraction one sort of segues into one of my favorites. Also, is a distraction technique in a sense is the straw man fallacy.
Hmm.
So in the straw man fallacy, the person attacks a position that the argument never advances. So the opponent's position is misrepresented, making it easier to critique. So it's sort of like switching out a position with a different one. So it's like the good old switcheroo. So like say the man is an argument, and you're like, oh man, like he's like maybe he's like a tough guy or something. You're like, oh, I'll take him out and I'll put in like the straw man. Oh, he's that should be a lot easier to attack.
Right.
So it's like I have an example that I got from Google or whatever. I thought it was funny. It's like the children's winter concert at high school should include non-Christmas songs too. And then the person B comes in. You won't be happy until Christmas songs are banned from being played on the radio. Like
Oof.
totally like misses the point and throws in this other argument that's like a lot easier to critique, right?
Hmm.
It has nothing to do with the first one. Like you switch out the first one, throw in this one. Oh, you won't be happy until all the Christmas songs are banned from being played on the radio. Like
Yeah.
and another example is like oversimplifying it too. There's another case of strawman fallacies rather than just switching out easier ones to attack.
Yeah, that's interesting. The one you just said there. It kind of the thing about straw man for me is that it kind of resembles the initial argument. There is a connection, but it's really just making a whole different argument
Hmm.
that or like framing that that person made an argument that they never actually did. So
Do you have another
I
example of strawman fallacy?
do I have another? Yeah, I mean the one that I like to bring up is like a more political one where it's like if somebody is arguing for healthcare for all, they'll say something like, "I think everybody should have healthcare, and we can make it affordable, yada yada." And then the person will attack them by saying, "You want to give illegal immigrants healthcare? That's going to take so much of our taxpayer dollars and all this stuff." And the person is going to be like, "What? That's not the argument I made. Like, of course those people wouldn't if they're not registered adults, they're not going to get the health card that's going to be distributed and like all this stuff." So, but it paints them in a really bad light. Like, oh, you want to give illegal immigrants the health care, and the citizens aren't going to like that
Right.
because they don't want to be paying their tax dollars to people who aren't paying taxes at all.
Yeah, a lot easier position to attack.
Exactly. Yeah. It would take you a lot more time and research to really come up with a good argument against healthcare for all, but there is a lot that we won't go into, but like cost and all those kind of things.
Yeah.
So, I think the next one I wanted to move to was an interesting one that's a slippery slope fallacy. So this is where you move from a seemingly benign premise to an extremely improbable end through tiny little steps. So essentially, in this argument, somebody says, like, let's say they say, oh, homosexuals being allowed to get married is going to make homosexuality more prevalent in the media and more prevalent in TV. And if my kid watches TV, then he's going to see these homosexuals, and then he's more likely to be gay. And I don't want my kid to be gay, right? This is a slippery slope argument, and it's extremely, this one is extremely inappropriate in my mind, but it's also, it's like connecting these little dots from one end to another and slowly making an argument that ends in this ridiculous position where your son becomes gay because you watch somebody else be gay in TV, and it all started because you allowed these homosexuals to have their
Hmm.
basic human right of getting married. So yeah, that's an example.
It's like point A to point Z.
Yeah, in half a second. There is a caveat to this though, because sometimes people will be claiming there is a slippery slope but actually every point is connected with evidence and is backed up. So, I mean, here's a ridiculous one, but let's say like you make an argument where you're like, I ordered something in the mail and then I got punched, and then don't order anything in the mail because you'll get punched in the face. And you're like, what? And like, listen, this happened to me. I ordered something in the mail and then it came in, it got dropped in the lobby of my apartment, and then somebody else tripped on it, and then they brought it up to my door, and they knocked on my door and they punched me in the face. Like, just don't do it. It's like, well, that seems like in theory that sounds like a slippery slope argument, but in actuality it did happen. Like all of
Yeah.
those steps did come, like this the end argument is don't order because you'll get punched in the face, which is ridiculous. But in this one case, it's more of like a story getting connected by these tiny little things.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Like a
Anyways,
anecdotal.
yeah, anecdotal. So yeah, be wary of that thing, of that form of argument too. Um, anyways, do you have any other ones?
Yeah, well, there's one I like. It's like a correlation versus causation,
Hmm.
and so essentially correlation does not equal causation, and causation being one event is the result of the occurrence of another event. So a causal relationship between the two events. Correlation does not automatically mean change in one event is cause of the other.
Hmm.
So, like an example of correlation is like the rates of crime increase when ice cream sales increase. It could be correlated, but it's not causation. It's not the cause. The ice cream isn't causing the crime.
Right.
It's correlated on like a data chart or whatever, but it's not the cause of the crime.
Hmm. Okay.
So I'll do it another example with grades, getting grades between high school and college. So getting high grades in high school gets you high grades in college. You like might think, oh yeah, that's definitely a causation, right? Like if I do well in high school, that should lead me getting to doing well in college. But it's correlated. It's not causation because there are more variables involved, such as hard work. It's not directly just doing well in high school will make you do well in college.
Hmm.
You also need hard work and yada yada yada, right?
Hmm.
However, you can make this a causation. If some of your high grades in high school were directly transferred to college and had the exact same grades, you would have that would be causation. It'd be the
Right.
direct result. There's no other variables. It's literally the same grade. Boom.
Right. Yeah. So in this fallacy, sometimes people will do what you said initially. They'll say like, "Oh, they got good grades in high school, therefore they're they got good grades in college. And you're kind of like, well, no, they got good grades in college because they stayed away from partying and they kept up their good studies and like yes, they had good grades in high school, but that isn't true for everybody in college. Like,
Yeah,
so
totally.
that's kind of like the argument fallacy there.
Exactly.
Cool. I think I had another one here that I wanted to talk about that I see a lot in arguments is the false dilemma or the false dichotomy. So essentially, this is where somebody will make an argument to you and they'll pose either a option and a B option, a black and a white option where they're polar opposites, but they won't give you a middle ground. And the answer is more likely to be in the middle ground for a lot of these. So my example is like, let's say you go to church, well, that makes you a good person. You don't go to church, that makes you a bad person. If somebody says something along these lines, like, if you're not going to church, you're just a bad person. And it's like, well, no, that's ridiculously black and white. You need to have some middle ground. You need to have some gray area where people can fall in. Not all people who go to church are good. Not all people who don't go to church are bad. There's a wide array.
Yeah, what if you
And
go once every 6 years?
yeah,
Like, oh man,
does
I
that
go
count?
to church. That means I'm good.
Yeah, all is forgiven. But it's, yeah, you'll see this kind of argument a lot where people will give you two options and they'll kind of be the extreme end of both of these options. So, like, if you're not a Democrat, you're a fascist. And it's just like, there is a middle ground, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have another one?
Um, I feel like they sort of these are like kind of like our favorites. I feel like there's just so many to go through, and they sort of overlap a little bit.
Hmm.
A lot of them seem to be sort of distractions to get you away from the main argument.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two that I'm seeing a lot with these fallacies, and the first one is a distraction, like you said, and then the second one is an appeal. Appeal meaning you kind of use another body as an example to help you prove your argument. So like appeal to authority, appeal to tradition. Like because we always did these things, that's why we're doing it now.
Hmm.
Or because this person who's above me says so, and you touched on that earlier with the Ten Commandments, we should go with that kind of thing. So
Yeah,
like these appeals and right are big when it comes to fallacies. So you should always be looking out for those
yeah,
kind
straying
of
away
things.
from arguments, right? Taking
Hmm.
authority over arguments.
Or like an appeal to emotion kind of thing where you're using somebody's heartstrings, you're pulling on their heartstrings to make them feel like your argument is valid,
Hmm.
right? Hmm.
Yeah, you see that a
Okay.
lot in advertising.
Yeah. The other part of going into an argument with critical thinking in mind is trying to remove biases, right? And we talked about this a little bit where you have all these ingrained biases that you're coming into, and there's a million and a half of them, so we didn't really want to go through it all. But
Oh
did you have
yeah,
anything to say about that?
yeah. Like biases are huge, and I don't know. I'll leave a link in the show notes or whatever of the wiki link of showing like kind of all the types of cognitive biases you can have, and it's unbelievable about how many you can have. So obviously, like no one's perfect and going to be directly unbiased all the time, but I think it's important to be aware of specific biases like
Hmm.
sunken cost, like the gambler's fallacy, um, because there's I could just keep naming them, but it's like being aware of these, you'll know, being like, oh man, like I'll use sunken cost as an example or whatever, right? Like you're like I know of like the sunken cost
Right.
bias. So say I'm like reading a book and I'm really not liking the book, and I know like man, if I just keep reading this, I'm essentially like sinking all this time for nothing. Like I might as well just stop reading it and move on.
Hmm.
Whereas if someone's not aware of this kind of bias, they're like, oh man, I just gotta keep powering through. I just gotta finish this book. So I think
Yeah,
kind of knowing these kind of personal biases and like the gambler fallacy, the gambler's bias or whatever, with like if we're like, oh, if I flip this coin, I see six heads in a row. I'm betting on tails because six heads in a row. It's going to be
right.
tails next, where it's no, it's 50-50. The coin is no different. It's going to flip.
Yeah. These are biases because you kind of have this ingrained perception that you have to do something, or that you thought something was true leading into this, and now it's kind of getting tested in your mind, and you're kind of thinking, oh no, the coin's definitely going to go tails this time. It's definitely going to go tails. It was heads so many times before, right? And you're betting all this money. And that's where you kind of have to always be without biases going into an argument and understanding these kind of things.
Yeah, exactly. So you can choose the most critical.
Yeah. I think the next thing after biases that I wanted to talk about was pseudoscience. So essentially, pseudoscience, in my mind, is something that resembles science. Like it kind of has the same feel. Maybe it has a similar name, but it doesn't have the same shape and the same sound as science does. Like it's not as thorough. So in the scientific process, you're kind of you're working in large groups, peer evaluated studies where somebody makes a claim, and then they prove it through investigation and through rigorous scientific processes and testing. And then another body comes in and they look at it and they read it and they do a critical review. Maybe they repeat the experiment, maybe they talk to the people who did it and they try to figure out. And then over time, you slowly, surely build up a body of evidence that leads you to either accept the claim or reject the claim. In pseudoscience, they kind of give you this same kind of quality, but they don't do as much rigorous processes and work. So, a good example of this would be stuff like astrology,
Yeah, my
homeopathy,
favorite.
na- naturopathy, and stuff like that. Or even like nowadays, you've got the Goop Lab that
Yeah, they're
that
on
you see.
Netflix. Oh
Uh,
god.
yeah, and like all this stuff, it seems like science. There, look, lab, pathy ends with a Y, similar to chemistry and biology. And this stuff is claimed to be science, but there's truly no background for it. There's no rigorous testing. There's no peer-reviewed articles for you to build up. So that one I just wanted people to be wary of, and to know that this stuff is not real. It's pseudoscience. So what do you think of all that?
Yeah, I know. I can't believe like stuff like that is sort of like run on like the Goop Lab getting such a big platform on Netflix. Kind of
Hmm.
just is like a head scratcher for me. It's like you're like they're being supported, like they're getting this being, oh yeah, you can just spew out whatever you want, where it's like, man, it's like people are spending all this money on this stuff, like it's negatively affecting people, and it's just, yeah, go ahead, just throw it up there on Netflix. And people like kind of trust Netflix because it's such a big thing, right? Like they actually
Yeah.
release some pretty good content.
Hmm. Yeah, this is one of those appeals, right? It's like appeal to appeal to authority, or appeal to the higher power that is Netflix, right? Like these or maybe you have an emotional attachment to Netflix. Like Netflix was one of the first big provider of content outside of TV that you could just subscribe and then watch without ads, right?
Hmm.
So now you're like, oh, I really like Netflix, and they've had all these great shows. Oh, and how could they give me this show that would be wrong about all this science, right? This
Yeah.
Goop Lab show. Like they wouldn't do that to me. Like this is an appeal to emotion. So
And
yeah, it's
they may
interesting.
not even think that either. They're like, "Oh, what's this new show on Netflix?" And then they watch it and be like, "Oh, this stuff's kind of interesting," and then like buy right into it, right?
Hmm.
Like not even being like, "Oh, why would they do this show? Like, why would they do something like that?" Just straight up being
Hmm.
like, "Wow, this is really interesting stuff." Not even like questioning it.
Yeah. And it's kind of it's hard for people to weed that out, right? Because they're watching documentaries on this where when you watch a documentary, you assume everything you're seeing and hearing from the documentary is true. And now y- you're watching this show on the same platform as those documentaries. You kind of make a connection in your brain. Oh, this is probably true as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
hard.
I just feel like it's not too common for someone to hear something like kind of like really interesting to like kind of write it down to look into it later.
No,
They
yeah,
kind of
definitely.
just being, wow, that's kind of cool, and then like they spread it by word of mouth or whatever. I go, do you hear about this? Yada yada yada, and the next thing you know, it's kind of spreading around.
Hmm. Yeah, and then it's not a singular person doing this word of mouth thing. It was on a huge platform. There's thousands of people doing this, right?
Hmm.
Spreading this misinformation. But anyways, yeah, I just wanted to add that little caveat about pseudoscience. So then the next thing that I wanted to talk about with this was, is this getting taught properly? Are students learning critical thinking early enough to have it ingrained in them at an early age so that they can use it in their day-to-day life, or are we missing it? Is there something we should change? And this is more of a discussion based section. Is there more we should change about our current education system? And should it be a mandatory class? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm just like speaking straight off of like opinion, straight out of like my experiences here. And I guess we can only really speak for kind of our system, like kind of Ontario's,
Hmm.
right? That's kind of what we went through.
Hmm.
So to answer sort of that question, I I'm leaning towards kind of no,
Okay.
that because a lot of the stuff I research in terms of the fallacies and biases and sort of not the philosophers aren't that big of a deal, but sort of like the structure to an argument and stuff. I was never really taught the structure to all that, right? I sort of just like,
Picked it up as you went.
yeah, like I just kind of felt like I kind of just thought more critically due to having more and more education, sort of going through the university and going through like a very heavy science, like applied science. You just ingrained to go through sort of research and stuff. But if
Yeah.
I was just to end at high school, I I don't think I would be thinking too critically, to be honest, because I was never really taught too much in terms of what types of arguments I'm seeing. Like if someone threw a straw man at me, I would just think like, oh, that's kind of ridiculous, but I wouldn't know in like that's a straw man and what someone's doing kind of thing, right? It'd be
Hmm.
sort of, I'd be easily taken advantage of.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes me think, well, should we teach it in high school? Maybe. And should we make it a mandatory class? Because there is philosophy in high school, and you learn math and science, and that kind of helps. But is is this a course that should be mandatory as a part of like a greater philosophy course?
It's
And yeah.
it's hard to fit in. Like I wish I had taken philosophy, but it wasn't like a mandatory class. It was something
Hmm.
you could choose in I think grade 12. But I had such, since I was taking like an engineering program, I had to take like all the sciences and all the maths, and so I only was only left with one choice on a specific timetable. I didn't really have much choice to choose kind of like a philosophy class where critical thinking is probably briefly described.
Right.
But I feel like critical thinking should be kind of taught throughout other subjects. I don't know if how much it should just be a whole class, right?
Hmm.
Because like
Yeah.
I know in grade, say like when in grade 5 when we were like one of like it what our teacher taught us a lot of chess. Like chess wasn't
Yeah.
a part of the curriculum or anything like that. But him teaching us a lot of chess developed a lot of skills that was
Yeah.
not something you would just develop by just ramming home the curriculum, right? So you can learn a lot of, I feel like I learned quite a bit of kind of deductive reasoning and like thinking abstractly and critical thinking skills through just learning about chess and stuff.
Yeah.
So almost just teaching stuff that kind of develop these skills that also involve kind of the curriculum, which it sounds probably really difficult, but I think that's something that should be very focused on.
Yeah, and it's we were lucky in that regard that we got to play chess and learn kind of outside the box thinking in regard to that game, and that helped us push towards more things in our life. But I would argue that having this, making space for it somewhere in between grade 9 and 12, maybe somewhere around grade 10 when you have other electives that you can take, making it a mandatory course where you learn about maybe a bit of history, philosophy, and then you learn about critical thinking, and maybe even like media literacy and digital literacy, because right now so much stuff online is false and misinformation, and it's hard for you to weed out what is true and what is false. And kind of teaching this early on in a classroom with a curriculum set up so that people, you're not kind of reliant on the outlying teacher who is teaching you critical thinking because they want you to learn that. It's built into the curriculum. Do you know what I mean?
It sounds like that's definitely something that should almost kind of be like get with the times. Like
Hmm.
it's surprising that we don't teach more about kind of digital literacy, whereas every like around us, everyone's sort of access to a computer, whether that be through a library or like at home, right? Like
Yeah.
going through all this sort of information online and stuff is like every like a lot of kids kind of have phones when they're in elementary school and high school now compared to when we went.
Hmm. So I think with that in mind, I in the whole discussion in mind, I did find some information about teaching around the world and how they did a study on how students thought they were getting taught. So they kind of asked students on a scale from 1 to 7, 1 being frontal, teacher based, and focused on memorization. So, like, memorize this stuff, and then the test, you're just going to have to spit it back out and write exactly what you memorized. To 7, 7 being encourages the students to be creative and critical thinking. So instead of getting memorization questions on your test, you're going to get stuff that's like, how would you approach this situation, or situational questions essentially. So around the globe, they asked these questions, and this was from, they did it over 3 years, 2017 to 2019. And they found that in countries like Canada, United States, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, these countries all were in the high sevens. They were very critical thinking, or that's how they assessed they were getting taught, was I more have to do more creative and critical thinking than memorization. But in countries like Argentina, Italy, Brazil, they were down around the ones and twos and threes, much lower on this.
Korea and
Yeah, kind of like countries that are more traditional, I'd say. That would be my theory regards to this. I didn't I didn't I don't have any way of proving that, but my theory would be that these countries that are lower are more traditional. Maybe they have more religious roots or more roots in authority towards their elders, kind of thing. So, what do you think?
it's it definitely kind of backs up to what I've read in books before. So in Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, there's like a chapter where he talks about uh Korea Air and like why it was such a horrible airline way back in the day.
Okay.
Is so they had a so they had the pilot and co-pilot, and the co-pilot was pretty much essentially useless because anytime he would notice something wrong or anything, they had such a strong appeal to like authority, respect your elders, like respect the guy in charge, that they would never kind of go against the pilot, right? The pilot's the guy in charge.
Okay.
So that kind of is like
So
more
like if
the traditional appeal to authority in terms of not so much creativity, right?
Yeah, and that was just based because it was out of South Korea, and all these pilots were South Korean, right?
Yeah.
That's
And
interesting.
Brazil being one of the bottom also for the memorization, not being creative is I read a book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, and he teaches in Brazil for a bit, and he's like asked them a few questions here and there. I think this is from my memory. This is what went down, and they're kind of like answering them all. And he's like, "Oh wow, these people like seem to know like exactly everything from kind of the textbook." And then he would ask them, I guess, more of an applied question, like sort of more like analogies and such, and they would just blank, know nothing, and you're like, what is, like, this is so weird, like, until you realize like that all they would do is just all memorize everything. They're just spent all their time memorizing everything and not actually like kind of understanding it all.
Wow, yeah, that's crazy.
So that kind of like that kind of syncs up with what this chart is saying.
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, like my theory would be that these countries are a little bit more traditional in their roots, and that also lines up, or maybe it has something to do with curriculum that we're not seeing, because based on what you're saying about Brazil, it seems like that's just how they're taught, and that's just how it's always been done, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
so it's definitely this system, right?
Hmm.
As well. Like the system's probably based off of those traditional thing, right?
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Systematic.
It's so it makes you think, like, how did these other countries um, create a different form of learning, and why is it better? Maybe it's not better. It's something that you might want to look into.
Yeah,
Um,
because you see like Denmark and Finland like way at the top ahead of like everyone else. And they're this more like more social
Progressive kind of
progressive,
countries.
that's the word I'm looking for. Yeah, countries. So definitely seems to be a lot more open towards creativity. And I know with like the Finnish education system, they're praised quite a bit for their very broad approach. So they do
Okay.
very few kind of standardized testing,
Oh, interesting.
and they really try to focus on more individualized teaching and learning. So I think just sort of that sort of stuff kind of contributes to it. They
Yeah,
they
and
almost have like a more progressive education system, like
than what you'd expect elsewhere, right?
yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think this kind of learning is, I would argue this kind of learning is better than the memorization form. And we've all kind of
Oh,
had
without
to
a
do
doubt.
both. We've had to do both within our career, right? I studied a lot of biology, and biology, you can understand it, but there is a lot of ingrained memorization that you're going to need to know, at least in my opinion.
No,
And
totally.
and that stuff for me was way harder to study for, and it just took time, right? It just took time to learn that stuff and just drill it into your head.
Yeah.
Whereas other things, there was, when you were learning other things like chemistry, you kind of had this click moment, this aha moment. Ah, I understand now. Now I can do this and apply this same thing to any question in the same scheme or same schematic. I can apply this
hmm
thing that I just had this aha moment to, and solve the question, right? So, and there's, and I think we would all we would all appreciate, and we all like the second one more,
Yeah.
the the click moment, right? So I think that really brings us to the end of our conversation here. Did you have any questions that you wanted to bring up about critical thinking as a whole?
Yeah, I think there's some questions that kind of come to mind that we can sort of discuss. Like, we'll just do one at a time. Like, do you think critical thinking kind of hinders creativity? Like, do you think it's kind of the spectrum where if you think too critically, you can't think like you can't think creativity?
That's interesting, because we were saying kind of before with the education, like thinking critically is thinking creatively, right? Or maybe they're more
Do you
similar
think they're
than we
more like
think.
codependent? They're sort of the same, like rather than
Uh,
being kind of opposite, they're kind of together on one side of the spectrum.
Maybe. I think critical thinking is definitely like coming at something unbiasedly and understanding fallacies and like trying to make a clear point in argument based on only logic and evidence.
Hmm.
And that kind of rules out this emotional creative side of things, right? You can obviously have these solid critical opinions, but then creatively, let's say you're trying to do something creative. Let's say you're trying to perform an art or something where you want this appeal to emotion. You want to like tug at people's heartstrings. In that case, yeah, I think you critical thinking is not what you want. You want to avoid it, right? You want to
Hmm.
try to be more creative and artistic in your thinking and in your decisions to do certain things, right?
Hmm.
So in that case, I think yeah, critical thinking can hinder creativity. I think.
It and it kind of ties back to the one of the Ten Commandments as well, in the sense, do not fear to be eccentric in opinion, for every opinion now accepted was once eccentric.
Right.
So like having like an eccentric opinion can kind of be like a form of creativity. Like
No, yeah,
you
that's
gotta
true.
think
Yeah.
creatively to think opposite, right? To think against the grain.
Hmm.
So that's sort of critical thinking in the same sense. So,
Yeah, and that's like kind of one of those like groupthink is another fallacy that we didn't really touch on, but
oh yeah.
essentially it goes where like if you have a huge body of people all saying one thing, then that's kind of more likely to be true. Or let's say like somebody says, "Well, of course I should believe this thing because everybody else does." But then you go, "Well, I don't think you have evidence besides that to really back this up, right?" And you kind of think more eccentrically compared to the group of people,
Hmm.
and then eventually you're able to prove you're right. Yeah. Did you have any other questions?
Another one I think we could discuss. Can you think too critically? Like, is there like a threshold where you're like, okay, maybe that's a bit too critical, like too rational? Like, because like you could almost being like critical thinking or rationality would be kind of one side and emotional be the other. Like, is there a
Mhm.
point where there you could just be only rational, zero emotional? Like, do you think
Huh.
that's kind of too much?
Um, to be a functioning human being, I think you have to have some emotion, and you can't be too critical. But when you're applying critical thinking, yeah, you need to have this kind of. I think this is an interesting question, especially when it comes to morality, because morality is kind of the intersection of critical thinking and emotion, right? Like
Hmm.
morally, should we do something? And the morality is based on emotion. It's not based on progress or evidence or anything like this, right? But it still is an important factor in how you create an argument. You have to have this moral argument
Like
as an attachment.
in order for you to come up with your moral beliefs, though, you have to think critically about them.
Yeah, but like sometimes your moral beliefs are based on the emotions of others or your emotions, right?
So at that point, that doesn't sound something that's too great, right? Because you're that's almost forming an opinion off emotion and not actually thinking critically.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I think in regards to that, you can think too critically. You know what I mean?
I think it's just like almost like a tough. I don't think there's kind of like a definite answer because
Hmm.
you kind of want to you decide that kind of like your morals or your beliefs kind of on your own, right? Like you want to figure them out for yourself, not like is this is how this person's beliefs are. I'll just copy them or whatever, right? Like you got to think
Yeah.
for yourself.
So you're saying when you build your moral system, you think critically. So
Yes.
therefore, therefore you can't think you're not over you're not thinking too critically, or you think there's no point in which you can't think critically.
I
You think
don't
you can't go too far?
I personally don't think there's too far.
Okay.
But I think it's unlikely to ever see only rational thinking with zero emotional, right? Like for an example, like say like your grandfather died or something, right? Like your rational self would be like, well, everybody dies. This is like this. I'm gonna be in dying too. Like it's inevitable,
Natural part
right?
of life.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's inevitable.
Whereas like then your emotional side is like just kind of like weeping. You're sad, upset.
Hmm.
So like it's just kind of how you want to
You
like
want to express yourself like.
sort of like how you want to live your life essentially how you like do your morals, right? Like I personally am a lot more on the rational kind of side of stuff, but I know a lot of people that are on the more emotional side.
Yeah, and it's not like one can be proven to be better than the other,
Hmm.
especially in regards to something like that where you lose a relative and it feels bad emotionally, but you're right, like logically, of course it's going to happen. Of course they're getting old, they lived a happy life, all these
Yeah.
things, but it doesn't stop this emotional side of you. And if you turn that off, people see you kind of as immoral.
Yeah.
They see you in a negative light. So yeah, I would say that there is you can think too critically, like that example you just gave. I would say
Hmm.
that's too much. You
Yeah.
have to have this emotional side.
And we're getting away from like in terms of an argument, right? In an argument I think you should always think critically, but we're just
Yeah.
speaking of stuff outside of arguments for argument's sake.
Good one. But yeah, you're right. Yeah. And what we talked about previously in the podcast is what we want you to kind of apply to your arguments in everyday life. But these questions kind of relating to everything else and how we're thinking critically are also interesting in my opinion. But so did you have anything else? Do you have any other questions?
um I think that kind of covers it for questions, but for sort of like an kind of relating it all to kind of the age that we live in now, I think it's like more important than ever due to the internet and connectiveness and such that we should really focus on learning critical thinking to be able to sift through all the information. Like we're just constantly being bombarded by new things every single minute. Like there's just like an information glut. Like so in order to actually sift through it all to get to the real stuff, like you really need to work on your critical thinking skills
Hmm.
and kind of avoid the confirmation bias because that can steer you in the like spiral into the wrong ways as well.
Yeah, I think I think just to elaborate on what confirmation bias is, it's when you are kind of searching for something and then if you have a preconceived notion in your mind, then you find something that backs that up, you double down on it, right? You're like, that's
Hmm.
I knew it. I knew it 100% because this one thing says so. But you found that because you were looking for it. That's like the confirmation bias, right?
Yeah, totally.
So I think to wrap up then, I think I want to go back to that analogy that talked about earlier with Trump saying fake news or the New Zealand president or leader saying, "Oh no, everything was done according to the books," right? And those are two things that are pretty much the same. And how do you decide? We talked about it all, and how do you decide who's telling the truth? Well, it's not so simple. You have to do a lot of research. You kind of have to take a step back, take an unbiased look at all the reporting around the claims that both the people made. Okay, did he actually spend this money? What was the money spent for? How did we find out about this? Did they release was there a press release about this? Was it in the legislation or was it a whistleblower or somebody something leaked, what is more likely the outcome? You know, was it justified or was it not? You have to kind of do a lot of research and critical thinking to understand who was telling the truth.
And
And that's,
sorry to interrupt, but also the each kind of news source and such that you're getting information from, they also have their own biases as well. So I
oh
think it
yeah.
helps to know that as well, because there's always news sources from each side putting their own spin on each information.
hmm So you just have to be digging and digging and digging and finding multiple sources, sources from all walks of life, all sides of the political spectrum, to really justify who was right and who was wrong. And I think that's why critical thinking gets overlooked a lot nowadays, is that it takes a lot of work. It's not
Totally.
easy to critically think.
And like when you can just open up, just like do a quick Google search, find the first article, read the first headline, and be like, okay, that sounds outrageous. I'm voting for the other guy or whatever, right?
hmm
Like it's easy just to make the easy choice, right? But being kind of educated on it is, I think, is really important, especially for like democracy.
hmm Yeah, I think that's what we wanted to drill home today when we talked about critical thinking. And I think that wraps it up for me.